Hi, my name is Janice Pope. I'm president of Anything But Boring, and we're going to demonstrate the new Creative Grids ruler, Bias Binding Simplified. Creative Grids are the rulers that have the grips on the back. Why am I so passionate about bias binding? I started my business as a quilt repairer. The part of the quilt that always had problems was the edge. The edge gets more wear and tear than any other part of the quilt, and bindings need to be replaced if they wear out too soon. Notice in this visual aid that the dark yarn represents the warp threads. These threads, referred to as the length of grain, will be the length of yardage you purchase, such as 1 yard or 2 yards, and they run parallel with the selvage. The green yarn represents the weft or the width of fabric and runs from selvage to selvage. Average quilting material contains around 70 threads per inch in both the length and the width of grain. You can see the selvage on this fabric. The length of grain has no give. The width of grain has a little give, but the diagonal or bias grain has a lot of give. The other nice thing about bias is it doesn't unravel. Notice that the selvages are woven tighter than the center of the quilt. This is why quilters remove them from their fabrics before putting them in a quilt. Knowing these facts allows us to choose the right bindings for our quilts. If a quilt is going to hang on a wall, then a width of grain binding may be just fine. But if it's going to live with people, being biased will help. This old quilt was made about 150 years ago. It's in incredibly good shape. In fact, the only part that's really bad is the binding. It was made with a width of grain binding. Width of grain binding only has 70 threads per inch in one direction and 1 thread the whole length of the quilt the other direction. As you can see, the edge has completely split apart and you can see inside the quilt. The other instance where bias is best is when you're binding curves. This beautiful quilt has what we call an ice cream cone edge. Bias is absolutely necessary when you're trying to go around these curves. And as you can see, the item lays perfectly flat. Using bias binding allows you to have 70 threads in 2 different directions. That gives your quilt a strength of 140 threads per inch with a bias binding. But because we use double fold on our quilts, that's 280 threads per inch. So if you have a width of grain binding folded twice, that's 2 threads versus 280 threads with a bias binding. What a huge difference! If the quilt is going to live among people, be drug around by a child, or put on a bed, you need to consider bias binding. I hope now you're motivated to make the strongest quilts that you can. We will now demonstrate how to use this new ruler. I'm taking the fabric from the bottom and folding it to the top. I'm now taking this point and folding it over the previous, so the fabric now kind of looks like an arrow. The next fold is to fold this in half and bring this point down to the bottom. The first cut, we're going to just remove the fold, so you're cutting about 1/4 inch. We'll now rotate the board and cut from the other side because I'm right-handed. Now if you are using a large piece of fabric, say a yard, to bind a queen or king size quilt, you will at this point need to fold this fabric down to here to get it small enough to fit under the ruler. As long as you keep these edges aligned, you will be continuing to cut the same bias strips. Now we'll sew our strips together. We're ready to sew our strips together now. You'll be joining them right sides together with a 1/4 inch seam. What you'll need to do is hang off a 1/4 little dog ear at each end. We'll be stitching from this intersection to this intersection. I usually chain sew all of mine together continuously until they're all done end to end. If you happen to be sewing a batik or a solid fabric, it's very helpful if all the seam allowances are on the same side. Because they look alike, it's hard to tell if you've got them right side or wrong side. So I'm going to give you a little tip. Once you've sewn your seam, fold to the left, turn and fold to the right, and that will always be your right side, so that when you join them right sides together, they'll be exactly alike. Press open all your seam allowances because this will help reduce bulk in your binding. We're now going to fold wrong sides together to make our binding. These folding, pressing, and cutting steps are all illustrated right on the ruler, so you don't have to lose a piece of paper. We're now ready to sew our binding onto the quilt. The first thing I do is place a pin about 6 inches from the end that I'm going to start sewing. I then put that on the side of the quilt and pin it in place. About 12 inches above that, I put in another pin. This will help me know when to stop so that I'll be able to join the two tails. I'm going to stop sewing 1/4 of an inch from the corner. You can use a pin to help you know exactly where to stop. Now you're going to turn the quilt around, and I don't cut these threads in between. You're going to fold your binding up so that it makes a diagonal line to the point, and then fold it down. Then we move it back under the machine and start sewing from the very edge. We're now coming to the end of the sewing, and when I get to the pin, I'll stop. Then we'll join the two tails. We're now ready to join our two tails. This was the beginning, this is the ending. What you do is place the ending tail inside the beginning tail. Now you take a pencil and in the seam allowance, mark a dot where this corner touches the ending tail. When you turn that over, mark that dot. Now we're going to remove this one, open this one, so we can see our two dots. We'll take our ruler and you place the dot right along this 1/2 inch measurement that's at the end of the ruler with the 45-degree angle, and we're going to mark this. Now we're going to cut this away. And this is very important. We're going to fold the quilt up, and using one of those nice big strong pins, we're going to pin it. This allows our tails to be free so that we can then join them right sides together just like we did the other pieces. Now hand press this seam open. When you unpin the quilt, just like magic, the binding pops in place. Now you finish your sewing from the beginning to the end. In recent years, I've added a step to putting on binding. Before I stitch it down, I also press it. I start first by pressing to lock the seams on one side. I turn the quilt over and press again just to lock the seams on that side. Then I fold it in the direction it needs to go. And finally I press it just the way it's going to sit on the quilt. This also allows me to miter the corners so they look very beautiful. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I hope all your quilts have beautiful bindings.